Okay, this is an addendum that I'll probably just tack and combine with the last recording. So I didn't, I should probably express out loud all the technical. The technical interpretation of Metagram is the completion of that will make me very happy because then I'll be finally finished. Anyway, so I'm going to explore the other things because I said some things which I think have the right principle in them, but I just need to expand them slightly. Because so essentially, what I said about the negate the negational emotional tones will be the same about the reinforcing ones, the ones that are I can't even remember the terminology that I used in the last recording, but the ones that have two positive emotional tones and the one takes the lead. That also those might exist as a positive as a in a gendered way, that essentially that the content might be in the one that takes the lead and the content might also be in the one, or it might be in both, maybe they're all in both, who knows, I don't know, or maybe it's like also that's dynamic essentially. So essentially it might all be somewhat relative to the growth of Metagram, or the maturation and development of Metagram, that essentially it could be also that half of it is projected and half of it isn't projected. And this is actually somewhat related to the Jungian concept of the anima and the animus, depending if you're male or female yourself or whatever, that you project the other one. Um, and that might be, until there's a kind of alchemical hermetic synthesis or whatever. Um, Hermetic alchemy is often essentially almost completely obsessed with essentially balancing and inculcating some kind of balance in the gender. And so essentially this might be where, let's say, spiritual karmic gender sort of thingies are related. Anyway, so all of those things might be interesting because on a technical level there might be a way to suss out if there is a either a propensity, or in a technical sense, if there's a fixed gender to some of the emotional tones and some of the manifestations of some type. Now, already I have a kind of brainwave about all the different sort of possible permutations of how this works in the structure, but essentially that um, if it is true that the metagram stages correspond to roughly the six elements in each side of the mind, because in some sense it is a model of the unconscious side of the mind. So running on that supposition within that framework, that then the the metagram in the unconscious side of the mind does this very interesting thing where it is surveying the subconscious, and it's surveying the it's weird because I would say that the in totality, because you see, like, metagram doesn't necessarily in some sense happen all at the same time, that all the six stages develop. I think that in some sense, like, they're all there in a kind of epistemological sense, but they're not there in an ontologically developed sense. And whatever isn't developed is kind of epistemologically projected, or let's say injected by the superego as a kind of environmental surrogate of a kind of the god of the world in the background, as it were, that still needs to be redeemed as the tree of life, essentially the kind of a stand-in of the Holy Ghost or something like that. That I'm just talking about sort of poetry and archetypal poetry, but or another way of saying that is essentially the thing that is gifting you your subconscious death and lust, which essentially is beginning the development of the false ego complex. So essentially rooted in your positive development of the false ego complex, which is being provided for by the superego, which is donating the constituent starting block for the false ego complex. Um, so in some sense, it is the superego's parent function, false prophet or whatever, is the gardener of you being born in the matrix. Neo had to grow up from parents and such like that. But you don't see that in the Matrix metaphor in the movie. Um, but there's a subconscious child underneath adulthood within the Matrix, as it were, and you come across Neo in the Matrix, and he's starting his work. He's got a professional life, he's got a private life, blah blah blah. What's my point is that the unconscious has to start off somewhere in modeling its position in some sense, and I do think that it gets a peek at the ego as well. That essentially the unconscious side of the mind, and what metagram in fact is, if the supposition is correct, that what metagram is it is what is going on in the unconscious side of the mind, from all the way from the subconscious. In some sense, also, the whole of metagram could also be symbolized by the false prophet or by the superego, um, as well. So, like looking at the superego from the perspective of the fact that the death and the lust was the superego's trial and sin. But in some sense, it's not really its trial and sin, because it doesn't have a trial and sin, because the superego doesn't have a vanity, it doesn't have a death, it doesn't have a lust of itself. It starts off as a parent function, which is why it can tend to the positive development of the false ego complex. So it just sort of, because it can make up its own backstory, and that's also how it can disguise itself in the environmental background. Okay, I'm just rehashing some stuff, but anyway, so what the unconscious mind is doing in some sense is that it's synthesizing all the positive architecture in the false ego complex, which starts off from the death and the lust in the subconscious, and it ends off with the death and the lust in the ego, and everything in between, including the unconscious side of the mind itself. So in meta-type terms, that is the terrain that the unconscious side of the mind is modeling, which means that also metagram, and I even thought about this, and it's even in my notes and in my research recordings that I've even uploaded onto YouTube, that I think metagram can actually be accurately extrapolated to be 8 instead of 6 sections, but essentially the last 2 sections are a repetition of the first 2. But it's complicated as well, because that's also not the best way to model it. But in some sense, because essentially metagram has to start the cycle again. It has to create a circle. It has to create a loop, and so it's six component parts that essentially are arranged into a cycle, into a loop. But essentially, on the second time round, there is a transposition of, in some sense, when the unconscious side of the mind starts, I think actually maybe it is. Even the start of the unconscious side of the mind is a product of the death and the lust in the fourth side of the mind, in the ego. That essentially the lust of the ego sends it back into the unconscious side of the mind. And that is like kind of leaving an imprint in terms of the vanity. Sorry, I know that this might be very hard to follow. I'm not making a lot of cogent sense, but in some sense I would say that this is very symbolic in the Matrix films, when Neo is talking to the old man who's looking at the machines in Zion. And he's like, we need these machines to live. And Neo says, "What's the point that you're making?" He says, "I don't know. I don't. But we're dependent on these machines." Uh, and in the same way, we were dependent on that unconscious side of the mind, also because it is the thing that helps us model field circuits, and that is essentially where transcendentalism, if it comes in anywhere, is going to come into it, is that karma is not to be destroyed, it is to be transcended, and it is to be, let's say, handled and managed, and even coped with, perhaps, as well. It is the medium of the world tree, of the tree of life as well, essentially. But you don't eat of its fruit trying to obtain knowledge of good and evil. You uh, just savor the flavor of it, as it were, and you have at least some constitutional uh, perhaps you need some knowledge of life in order to know not to try to unveil the Holy Ghost, but you know why it's forbidden in some sense. Um, because then you can't live within the Holy Ghost if you try to unmask it. Uh, uh, anyway, I'm kind of talking cryptically, but sadly it's necessary because a lot of this is so dense. But essentially, so what I think is happening in the unconscious side of the mind, which if that is what Metagram is a model of, the essentially the unconscious side of the mind, which is the unconscious. So in some sense, the unconscious side of the mind has, in metatype terms, six elements. It has its own death, its own lust, its own vanity, its own enticed lust, its own inferior function, its own sin. And let me just rename some of those. So the lust is the child function in MBTI approximate jargon. The vanity is the hero function or the dominant function. The enticed lust is the parent function, and the trial is the inferior function. Um, and then you have this very toxic interference where the parent function is essentially managing the inferior function for the hero function, because the hero function does not want to have its beautiful structures, let's say, it doesn't want to have its parade being rained on by the inferior function. And eventually, if the hero function creates a kind of antithesis against the inferior function, and the inferior function is a bit too unwieldy, then essentially the parent function will try to jettison the inferior function and give it its own independence and associate it in its eyes. The parent function will root the inferior function into a new side of the mind. It will kind of try to donate the inferior function um, into a new entity, into a new, and that is essentially what the ego is in terms of its death and its lust, because the death and the lust are the inferior function and and is the sin of the unconscious side of the mind. So this is why when I say that you can go from 6 to 8 is that the 6 things also then get a repeat, because the last 2 things are another 2 things, which in some sense are also decide to link back up or to transpose themselves into reviving the cycle of metagram, let's say reinvigorating or re-stimulating, which is kind of like a bit of Scientology jargon, the first the first 2 stages of metagram in some sense. And so then you're trapped in your own internal false ego. You're trapped in the side of the mind. You're trapped in the unconscious side of the mind. Um, in this internal cycling, as it were, because essentially your architecture. Now, that architecture, so I do think that in some sense, it's very clear that in some sense, the death and the lust of the ego side of the mind is the same as, or is literally the same metatype constituent that makes up the trial and the sin of the unconscious. It is repurposed. It does have this dual use, as it were. And in some sense, that then those 2 things are very important, because they can choose either to serve the free theta on the ego, or they can choose to reinvigorate or re-stimulate, let's say, the reactive mind and the unconscious side of the mind. So in some sense, what I'm saying is that metagram is the reactive bank in Scientology jargon, but it's also, and this conforms to what I've said all along, that essentially you cannot stop having a metatype, but you can stop having a metagram. I don't know how often I've said that in recordings, but I say it when I'm describing my system to other people on the internet. Um, that, to put this in typology jargon, because I can analogize my system to things in typology, is that metatype is like MBTI, and metagram is like Enneagram. And so basically, what I say is that you can't stop having an MBTI type, but you can stop having an Enneagram type, and you should, in fact. That's part of, let's say, spiritual growth or self actualization or whatever. But sometimes I don't think you can actually do it without probably my model, because my model is so much more precise and incisive and things like that. But also that, to put it this way, how do I put it? Keegan stage, I mean, I call it Keegan stage 5, but I don't think there is a Keegan stage 5. I'm not sure. But because, I mean, he talks about Keegan stage 4.5, which is a kind of apathy, I think, or something like that, where you get stuck in stage 4, and then. But what I would call Keegan stage 5 is that you're. I've never read his book, but someone else explained his basic theory to me that what you want to do is you want to connect stage 4 with your ego side of the fourth side of the mind with the superego, which means you actually have to be able to crucify the trial and the sin of your ego side of the mind. And those two cognitive functions are, or actually, that involves three cognitive functions. That involves the parent function. The parent function will be the flesh. The trial or the inferior function will be essentially the torture, and the sin will then be contained within yourself. So you won't have, because you see, sin is an emergent property. You like no one. The only thing that you can hope to do is to sin consciously. You cannot stop the sin, but you can, let's say, burden it as an individual for its emergence. And when you burden it on your shoulders, then that gives you the might, as it were, to, in 3 days' time, then essentially your superego gets revivified. Your the parent function, the false prophet, gets a purification. Um, Although perhaps not right away. Maybe it requires some sussing out. But essentially, the parent function, you get new eyes on the parent function in your superego, and in some sense, your ego, your fourth side of the mind, is connecting with the Keegan stage 1, which he never really talks about because that's child psychology, and that's very hard for people. And Keegan is also aggregating a lot of things. He doesn't perhaps understand these structures because he doesn't have, like, my kinds of modeling and my kinds of research. He's aggregating a lot of things. I'm sure he knows some things, but I think his whole book, I think, only really starts at Keegan stage 3 and 4, or because he kind of gives 1 and 2 as a kind of given, because he says most people essentially develop through those stages. I actually disagree. I would say that essentially ADHD has a lot to do with what I would then call Keegan stage 1 and 2, even though I believe that he hasn't actually described those, because he just kind of gives that as a given, as the starting point of his book, which I don't actually know what his book is called. But anyway, it's not that important. Um, but yeah, I guess what's just brilliant. Okay, and then bipolar is because essentially some metagram circuitry has dual circuits and things like that, and there are different forms of dual circuitry, which I think explains bipolar type 1 and bipolar type 2. Um, and then also understanding how people who don't have their metagram types do not have a presence in each field circuit, means that they can kind of be sandwiched, or let's say they can kind of be maneuvered into a very rigid kind of reactive um, interrelationship with, kind of, let's say, the false ego psychic energy from others. So essentially, because a field circuit, you could just say, is a shared, I don't know. Field circuits are made up of other people's false ego energy, as it were, or their own internal circuitry, but they can impinge this internal circuitry on each other. They can collaterally buttress or correspond to other people. So essentially, people can use each other like serial computers to computationally process their. They can have an outflow from their metagram. I mean, sometimes I don't think you can even have a communication without an outflow from your metagram in some sense. So I do think, in some sense, you can use your metagram in a transcendental way. So in some sense, I think that you don't have an internal circuit because you're not using it, but you still exercise it in some sense. It becomes like an antenna. It becomes like a capacity. So it's not an active, and actually it might have some active energy in it. But you're capable of actually dissipating that active energy inside yourself because you can essentially pass it up the chain of command and burden it in your own sin, and then get your parent function in your subconscious, sorry, in your superego, to essentially resolve it, and that would essentially be the action of the Holy Ghost as well, in some sense. But because the reason why it's kind of mysterious is because the sin in the ego and the parent function in the parent function in the superego has to go through three things that never existed. It has to go through well, two things at least, but essentially it has, and those two things are outside of your metatype. They don't exist inside your metatype. So there are two. There are two. There are two metatype dimensions of psychological reality. There are two spheres of um, cognitive operations, which are essentially the root of the world tree, the root of the tree of life as well. Um, and I know that that sounds slightly sacrilegious because, essentially the world tree is, but essentially I would link it here to the spirit of man, is that the spirit of man needs to actually not be destroyed. That it does actually have a proper place, and this is also part of the synthesis of the Son of Man, um, which is, you could also say, essentially the idea that Adam is not just your great ancestor, but is also the descendant of your understanding. Uh, that essentially we do not we do not in this way also time is somewhat, the temporal determinism is somewhat overcome. um, Anyway, okay, this is the big picture. Let me just go back to the technical things because that is what I'm trying to technically explore here. So what is happening in Metagram, right, in Metagram circuitry, is that, and this is, I think, what is growing in young people in some sense, and there are some developmental stages that are harder than others, but in some sense, the development or the inculcation of responsibility for Metagram circuitry is essentially the long march of developmental psychological integration or whatever. And so, like a very young person will only have the first two, or because essentially you have to start somewhere. So you'll almost be saddled with the first stage, and the second stage will be naively explored. And then the third stage, like, because whenever you're on a particular stage, the next stage is kind of always naively being projected onto the environment for you to assimilate next in some sense, or for you to grow in responsibility, therefore. So as you grow in self-determinism and you inculcate this, and you start taking responsibility for this experience, this external experience, obviously the real trouble is essentially when you're in the last two stages, and then how those two stages are then redigested in some sense, because the weird thing though is that I don't even know if this metagram model works that well, because in some sense it's weird that, like I say, that okay, it's going in this order, that the metatype circuitry is going in this order, and in some sense you can model it as 6 or 8 because the last two are redigested, but then the actual metagram emotions are a binding of all the metatype components, from the subconscious death and the lust all the way up to the ego's death and the lust, and it even has a footprint over the unconscious mind itself. So you've got these kind of, I was even going to start making some tentative technical classifications about how, some emotional tones are, let's say, made up of constituent elements that are in the same stack. And when they're in the same stack, then I think that you can even say that there's something likely that the one is going to occlude the other one. Essentially, you're going to have, for example, a prominent subconscious or a prominent unconscious or something like that, that essentially you're going to actually, there's going to be an attitude within your metatype that is going to essentially elect or at least emphasize one. So metagram will essentially decide for you. To put a long story short, this is why some people who share the same MBTI do not share the same Enneagram, and essentially why they have quite a different style, but they have, let's say, some of the same cognitive physiology as a metaphor, but why they have a different balance within the use of that physiology, why they have a different proclivity or something like that. They have a different weighting they have a style of using their own cognitive physiology or anatomy, or it's just a metaphor. And this is why it can also, so in the end it will be much easier to type people based on metagram rather than just pure metatype. Anyway, but then let me just say the other imaginative things that I had. So in some sense, when you have the two constituents of the emotional tone are inside the same stack, and also there might also be an ambiguity as well because of the double representation. Because, for example, each trial and sin is also something else's death and lust, or not. That's not true for the ego, but because the ego's trial and sin is the terminal trial and the terminal sin, but all the other ones, in some sense, they're all repurposed. And so because of that repurposing, that also means that some things might, in used in a certain way, might give you, let's say, a way to look under the curtain and see the Wizard of Oz, and actually experience your own superego in a weird way. And also in the same way, you might also get a double bite at the same cherry in being able to see the same emotional tone developed in a way that obtrusely undercuts, you kind of, you see it from the other side of the mind, you see it. So essentially you can kind of understand that you have multiple subjective purviews within your own psychology in some sense, so there are clues there within the metagram circuitry that can be repurposed in order to understand that essentially you are two different sides of the mind and things like that, and that might even be discovered, but also only discoverable by some particular kinds of false ego complex as well. In some sense, I do think that I might be incredibly lucky because essentially my false ego complex, which I did design on purpose to be maximally complicated so that I could be a good guinea pig for my own research, um, because I did have a metatype, I think, my whole life, but I did not have a metagram, or at least I didn't believe that I did until the age of 7. But anyway, um, that's up for review, I guess, after I've done more research, but or after I finish this leg of the research. But that's kind of what I've generally thought about myself. But what is my point? That I did that, and I chose a certain. Some of these insights might not be gleanable internally to some people. I mean, it also, I mean, I'm a double circuit type, which means essentially also that I can be that I have two different subjective, very clearly two different subjective perspectives that I can, let's say, inculcate within myself, or what's the word, garner, or whatever. Other people, I think, can still have that same insight, but they would require what I think this is the function of the church, of the communion, um, that you can see yourself from somebody else's perspective. Uh, another person has an understanding, they break it apart and they feed it to you, and you break apart your understanding and you feed it to them, and you can actually um, break the bread, break the flesh up into digestible, and in some sense, this is also being able to see the other side of in the field circuit, as it were. So essentially, being able to have different eyes on yourself from other perspectives in the field circuit probably gives you the idea that there are other sides of your own mind, because you can emulate the understanding that is being fed to you by somebody else, and you can somewhat so I do think that the field circuits are important because they also allow us essentially to inculcate within ourselves a second conglomerated at least a second, or in general a conglomerated um, perspective of our own. In some sense, it gives you the cultural edifice and platform upon which to view one's own let's say the anyway, this is the kind of, I think, systemic knowledge which is garnered when Keegan is talking about people getting enculturated into learning liberal arts, and then, graduating to Keegan stage 4 of development, although you can't do that anymore in the liberal arts that is taught today because it's so poisonous with postmodernism, essentially. And I think Keegan says that essentially the only way that you can still have that is if you study STEM, basically, and even that is coming under fire. But it used to be that essentially the sanest part of a society would perhaps, well, I mean, I criticize foreign legal traditions, but essentially, if you don't have advocates, if you don't have high level legal minds that are very systematized and mature and developed in their thinking, then you have a very outrageously sick society that's unable to correct itself. Um, anyway, what else? So, okay, anyway, I was just talking about how you can understand your own emotional tones and even come up with perhaps alternative in, and this might also be what is explored within some of the creative processing in Scientology, um, which I think might be a better way of understanding theta claire, essentially having a certain mastery over creation, maintenance, and destruction of mock-ups, and the confidence in the usefulness of those things. But anyway, or the efficacy, let's say the spiritual efficacy of those things. Um, what else? Yeah, at some point, I think the crucifixion is still a bit fuzzy for me in very clearly delineating it, especially in the 17 model component parts. That would also be very useful, but that's a metatype issue, and I'm still dealing with Metagram at the moment. But for example, the sin of my ego is dimension 3, and the, let's say, the root of the world tree, which is underneath the false prophet, is dimension 4 and dimension 5, and then the false prophet is dimension 6, which needs to obviously, I wonder if the lake of fire is dimension 4 and dimension 5, or if, but essentially, archetypally at least, those are the days. On the third day the Christ is resurrected, and so I think that the first day is dimension 4, the second day is dimension 5, and the third day is dimension 6 within my metatype. And if I use that as a model, I mean, maybe they're all the lake of fire, all three of those. But what's going on there is that essentially it's, well, if Christ is dead during those days before the resurrection, it's just kind of, is that there's a passage through those days. There's a spiritual alignment of those, using these dimensions of psychological reality as a 17-day calendar, and these 3 days of that 17-day calendar are part of the rebirth, or the resurrection of the Christ, because essentially it's that dimension 3, the sin on dimension 3, the sin of the world is being absorbed in the body, and therefore it is going into edifying or purifying the false prophet and making it a true prophet, perhaps, or something like that. And then essentially dimension 7 and dimension 8 in the subconscious perhaps stop being a death and a lust, perhaps. Or perhaps they don't stop becoming a death and a lust, but because the whole metatype still functions, but now it is actually sort of corrected within itself, it's redeemed. And that the problem with the death and the lust in the subconscious is that it never had a stable grounding, because it was always just being prompted by the false prophet, which had no backstory. But now there is a backstory. Now dimension 4, 5, and 6 actually has a it was resurrected. It was a death that was resurrected, and it was a death that was internally derived from the internal false ego complex in some sense. So it kind of, it redeems the understanding, one hand washes the other hand or something. But anyway, it's something like that perhaps. But anyway, it's still important for me to talk about dimension 1, 2, and 3. Because dimension 1, this is the weird thing. I mean, this also makes me a bit crazy because I'm thinking that maybe metatype, some of the theory in metatype might have to be changed for other types, because I'm a metatype 13, and perhaps it's just too much of a coincidence that dimension 1 is actually the flesh in my crucifixion, and dimension 2 is actually the torture in my crucifixion, and dimension 3 is actually the sin um, in my ego. And I have in past recordings said that essentially it's somewhat arbitrary where you start. So it might be that everyone's calendar starts on a different day, perhaps. But that's an afterthought. But it would be interesting to work out if that would make efficacy in terms of therapeutic clinical intervention, if shifting the 17 model, because it is somewhat, where you start and where what is the first dimension, what is the 17th dimension, you can kind of just move it around like a fractal. You can make dimension 3 dimension 1 and just shift everything up. Or basically, because it's the procession of the ordering that needs to stay. Because after dimension 17, it just goes back to 1 again. It's a that's the new earth, new heaven sort of thing. But anyway, okay. Anyway, let me. I've gone all over the place. Let me. Did I finish what I wanted to say about the unconscious side of the mind in Metagram? So I talked about gender. I talked about extending it from 6 to 8. Which might also be more technically complicated than that, because I did see some interesting things that essentially, at least in my type, and I haven't compared this with other types, but at least in my type, you didn't get constituent components of metagram beyond the parent function, I believe. So that's itself interesting. Wait, it might have included the inferior function, but I mean, again, that's just only my type, so that's not. And also, I still am confused about the ordering of the whole thing. Like, what does the ordering mean of the emotional tones? And can you essentially associate each stage to the death, the lust, the vanity, the enticed lust, the trial, the sin of the unconscious side of the mind? And then in some sense, then you would have to also go the death and the lust of the ego, and repeat the last two stages twice in some sense. And in some sense, that repeated stage as well might be the whole trick of self-actualization and development, because that is how you orientate yourself towards Keegan stage 4, and how you essentially break the endless cycling of the unconscious side of the mind and involution inside of it, and how you orientate yourself towards your free theta in essentially, I think it might also be connected in conceptual terms in Scientology to the tone arm. And essentially, because then you have different consecutive cognitive functions that correspond to the vanity, the enticed lust, the trial, and the sin in the ego, that particular those particular four cognitive functions will give you a certain characteristic of a tone arm in a type. Yeah, because that will be the characteristic of the free theta in a type. Okay, that's an important point to make, because and then that is why essentially people have different tone arms. And my tone arm is quite interesting because it essentially is dimension 17 is the start of my tone arm. Now let me think about it. Because dimension 3 is my sin, dimension 2 is my trial of my, I'm talking about my ego. Dimension 1 is the parent function, and then the vanity is dimension 17. Yeah, so my tone arm is dimension 17 is the dominant function, which is the apex. If my ordering of the cognitive functions is canonical, but again, that, well, yeah, I mean, I guess I was being perhaps a bit too humble as well. I mean, I do think that there is something to my ordering of the 17 model that is proper, but anyway, still, like, symbolically or whatever, it might be worth it to see if that might be a therapeutic modality when dealing with other metatypes. Yeah, so my tone arm is dimension 17, following onto dimension 1, 2, 3. Okay, well, at least I've defined some things now, and I've perhaps corresponded some things with Scientology, which is quite interesting. Again, the problem, though, is, well, I hope I'm right. I hope I'm on the money in terms of understanding metagram as an unconscious thing, but it's still the technical structure of that, or the technical interpretation of metagram, will signal finally the end of the theory, or the finishing of the theory, rather. I'm so close. I can taste it. This bloody clerical work. I need to learn how to code. I mean, I've got a vague idea now how to represent it in some sense. The problem is that there might be some ambiguity in representation, but and that will also give me some technical insight as to the theoretical variance in terms of what's actually going on, because there might be some complications within some types, which is why some people might be prone to certain. I think I've already described things in this recording that I think would relate to schizophrenia. But anyway, and also how certain, in the last recording I talked about how I think arrested development in metagram would also be a signature to certain forms of perhaps be related to a better way of systematizing psychopathologies, like perhaps also borderline, because essentially, obviously, it wouldn't just be, oh, you have an arrested metagram. It's that your arrested development in metagram also has these particular structural complications and convolutions and occlusions, and you're stuck in this eddy. You're stuck in this entrenched, self-impinged. Yeah. So there we go. Okay, I have been thinking about it some more, and I've jumped off the deep end on theorizing, so I might as well run with it and just see how close I can get to finishing it off. I mean, the technical interpretation of metagram is still something that needs some fine tuning and work, and I will talk about that after talking about. I mean, because this will at least give it context, at least if this wild theorizing holds water. But essentially, I think I am correct in the description of the tone arm, or the potential of free theta in a case, which essentially will correspond to the ego side of the mind, from the vanity to the sin, and I think actually plus two as well. That essentially so in my case, as a metatype 13, that is the cognitive function corresponding to the 17th dimension of psychological reality, is the vanity of my ego side of the mind, the and then the enticed lust or the parent function, or the vanity is like the dominant function or the hero function in MBTI-esque metaphor. Um, and then it goes from 17 to the first dimension, because 17 is the last dimension, and then you start again. So the first dimension is the parent function. Sorry, the first cognitive function is my ego function's parent. Sorry, is my ego side of the mind's parent function. And the second dimension, or second cognitive function of psychological reality, because my 17 model is essentially like a hierarchy, whatever, of cognitive functions. So it always goes in this order or whatever. So my ego side of the mind's inferior function or trial, in the Christian scriptural language, it's the trial that follows from the enticed lust, as I think James describes it. James or Luke, one of them. Which is the inferior function in MBTI-esque language. And then the sin is the third dimension of psychological reality, because I'm a metatype 13, so that's how it works. And then the tone arm, I think, does also include two more dimensions, which are, let's say, above the sin or in line with the sin. So when the sin is properly crucified, then the later two dimensions also come into alignment. But they come into alignment, let's say, passively or indirectly, as a correspondent manifestation of the state of the tone arm as represented by the sin, which in some sense you also can't control the sin directly. You can only control the parent function and the trial, or you can, that's a bit of mixed jargon, you can only control the enticed lust and the trial, in order to let's say take full responsibility for the sin, which is, and because the sin is an emergent property, it's the sin of the world. So when you are conscious of the sin in your false ego complex that is an emergent property of the world, and you bear it, you take responsibility for it consciously, then your tone arm extends to not only the sin, but two dimensions past the sin, and in some sense maybe a third dimension past the sin, which is essentially an influence that is encroaching on the false prophet, which was essentially the shadowy player behind the donation of the original death and lust that was given to the subconscious. So through the ego redirecting its tone arm, or cleaning up its tone arm, the subconscious is essentially redeemed and purified in some sense. Not in terms of the subconscious's sin, but in terms of the subconscious's death and lust. But it requires those 3 days before Christ is risen, before the anointed of God is risen. Anyway, so I do think that essentially the perhaps that is the better way of conceiving of the crucifixion, is that you're getting your whole tone arm in alignment, and a lot of those things are essentially vanity, from the vanity to the sin in the ego side of the mind. That when those things are in alignment and being properly managed in terms of your free theta, then that free theta essentially fixes and sort of grows the tone arm to extend beyond the sin into the 3 subsequent dimensions of psychological reality, in compliance or in conformance with that style of how the sin itself is being burdened responsibly, the sin of the world. Okay, now I should actually probably do more clerical work before I continue to theorize about the metagram. But anyway, I'm just going to delve into very radical theorizing. So essentially, I think what's happening in Metagram is you've got. So, I mean, how I would model it at the moment is that you would take the unconscious side of the mind, which has 6 component parts, and you would lay them out. And it's slightly complicated because essentially the first two stages of the unconscious side of the mind are also shared by the subconscious, because the death and the lust of the unconscious is also the trial and the sin of the subconscious. And then similarly, the last two stages, the trial and the sin of the unconscious, is also the death and the lust of the ego. So I don't quite know how to resolve that. So there might be some ambiguity in those sorts of things, but Metagram might even have that already built into it, because Metagram does, in the Metagram signatures that I described, there are complications, there are things like that, but also just because Metagram is complicated, maybe those complications take into account this ambiguity, and maybe it is a natural metatype ambiguity in some sense, that essentially how it doesn't have a fixed correspondence to metatype, and maybe that ambiguity is also how certain maladies, certain psychopathologies manifest, because essentially one can be using metatype anatomy in order to function Metagram, or in order to operate the Metagram sequence, or whatever, the Metagram emulation of reality, or something like that. Because in some sense, I do think that this is the biggest problem in development, is the unconscious side of the mind, because it's sandwiched in the middle of illusion, because the ego itself at least has the definitive position of being the terminal, because the sin in the ego side of the mind is the terminal sin. There's going to be no sin greater than that. That's going to be the terminal sin. There's no new side of the mind to hand it off to. In some sense, it when you sin unconsciously in the ego, which is also, I think, also maybe a technical impossibility, but just to say, if you want to delude yourself into thinking that you can sin unconsciously, all you are doing, in fact, is essentially charging up an unconscious environmental unlawfulness, which is going to be inherited by the false prophet, to essentially inject into um, the subconscious apparatus of the death and the lust in the subconscious. So there's going to be a karmic bond that is going to, let's say, be infused in the, let's say, I used to have this, I can't readily recall it, but I used to have this very good metaphor as to how the false prophet related to the subconscious, in terms of that the ego would have the possibility of renegotiating. The metaphor with this is that in the Matrix movie, the other Neos of the Matrix that would eventually start the cycle anew, they would negotiate with the architect to have a slight revision to the program, in some sense, because essentially, as the free radical of the one, he would essentially just novate the architectural system to some small degree. So essentially, he would have a bargaining position with the architect of the Matrix. But Neo in the Matrix movie is greater than that, because Neo is dealing with he actually doesn't just talk to the architect. He goes outside to the machine world, and he negotiates face to face, and he has to win that negotiation. It's not anyway. I've kind of messed up that metaphor a bit, but the point is that I used to have this wonderful thing where I talked about the update of the contract with the false prophet, essentially. Anyway, so we don't want that. But let me confine myself to Metagram. So the issue with Metagram really is that the death and the lust in the ego side of the mind is somewhat propitiating the vanity in the ego, which is the first. So I'm just trying to think of the word that means like beachhead is the first beachhead of free theta. That kind of, that's where the contract is written in some sense, or at least that's when the fate of the contract is already kind of in some form, because in some sense it's kind of like these are the facts that the contract is going to have to actually get to grips with in some sense. And so it is the state of the vanity in the ego that essentially makes you not be able to be transcendent over the metagram in some sense. Um, and in some sense, to the degree that metagram is a self-induced cycle of something, it is because of the death and the lust in the ego side of the mind, which is perhaps somewhat correspondent to the trial and the sin, because of the unconscious side of the mind, because those are the same cognitive function. But in some sense, that entanglement or that transposition or whatever has latent within itself a kind of a command to start at the beginning of metagram again, to start at the perhaps the to start at the trial and sin of the subconscious, which is repurposed as the death and the lust of the unconscious side of the mind, which is, let's say, properly where the beginning of metagram starts. So if we can understand that essentially the whole of metagram is betwixt 2 points. It's betwixt the parent function of the subconscious, or the enticed lust of the subconscious, which is allowing the unconscious side of the mind to take on the role that it takes, and it's between the vanity in the ego. So between the vanity in the ego and between the parent function of the subconscious, or the enticed lust of the subconscious, whatever you want to call it, metagram is occurring. And it's occurring generally between perhaps, well, I don't know how to technically map this out yet or model it, but it could either be described as 6' stages, in which the first two are doubly sourced and the last two are doubly sourced or doubly correlated, because the first two and the last two have 1 foot in one and 1 foot in another. Although the 1 foot, the two beginning stages, let's just say, are are guarded by the parent function in the subconscious. That essentially, by the fiat of the parent function in the subconscious, there is a certain denial that the first two stages started off as subconscious. Some sense the subconscious, and this is also the kind of arrested development where the metagram itself becomes strenuous in terms of its epistemological status. That very young people, perhaps, but also people that never grow up or develop or something like that, they never learned how to, let's say, mediate the transition between the seat of consciousness of the subconscious into the unconscious. They didn't want to give up the keys to the driving wheel or whatever. They because when you give yourself over to the unconscious, then you become a new being in some sense, and you leave your subconscious behind. So I would say narcissism, to a large extent, has that kind of relationship to the unconscious, that they see the unconscious, but they treat it like a sandbox. They treat it like a they have a kind, and borderlines as well, I think, have like also have a kind of surreal abuse of the unconscious side of the mind, although borderlines are more sophisticated because they are looking at it from the ego side. Um, Whereas narcissists are looking at it from the subconscious side, and they don't get to see their own state of their own ego function to some degree, because um, in some sense, because the trial and the sin of the unconscious, I think, is off limits to them. The trial and the sin, the last two stages of their metagram cannot coalesce, because they never had the healthy narcissistic phase of development where they could explore the unconscious side of the mind, and they have to project at least the last two stages of, like, probably the kind of parental figure that they had, the dead mother sort of concept that Sam Buckner speaks about, was so overbearing and so, let's just say, representative in some sense to them of the last two stages of metagram, that they've got that fixed as an, as a I'm probably going to screw up the terminology, but essentially as an introjective projection. That I like saying introjective paradigm, that they've got an introjective paradigm which is the model of their unconscious side of the mind, which is in some sense the model of their metagram to some degree, and there are fixed components in that metagram, stages of that metagram, which are built into a kind of projection or something like that. So they are in a simulation of a metagram, and what makes it a simulation is that they have set it up so that certain emotional tones in their metagram sequencing are already projected into the environment in some sense. And that was kind of the overbearing presence of the dead mother or something like that, meant that this was the only way that they could explore an unconscious side of the mind, was to delimit it at the outset of the creation of an introjective paradigm. So essentially their unconscious side of the mind is not real. It is an introjective paradigm that is built on these objects, this dead mother object in some sense, in which the final stages of metagram are projected onto the environment as a simulation in some sense. And so there is no reality. They don't have full reality on the unconscious side of the mind. There is no full reality on metagram in some sense, which means that they can't gain access to their ego. Now, borderlines are interesting because they, and I should say more about narcissists, but I've kind of exhausted that topic in my head, and now I just want to catch up borderline, and then maybe I'll go back and be able to fill in more. But borderlines do, in some sense, borderlines, I think, are the dead mother. They want to be everybody else's dead mother. They want to inculcate other people into narcissism, in some sense. They want to be the unilateral director. They want to be the sediment throughout which the simulation is anchored. They want to be the clearinghouse of the unilateral narrative, that they are the queen bee thereof. And so they actually steal away for themselves, let's say, a in some sense they are like they are enlightened, but their form of enlightenment, they don't understand it themselves. This is quite much my same sort of critique against enlightened people that don't understand their own enlightenment. They are seeing the sudden from the left hand side of the divided line between the lesser of the lesser and the lesser of the greater. But I should really make that diagram that I made available. But kind of Platonic metaphysics. But anyway, the point is that, or maybe I'll be able to work out how to put it into this recording so that it flashes to that. Let me look at the minutes of this, because maybe I can work 20 minutes and 20 seconds, so maybe it'll flash to that for the rest of the video. Anyway, it's not that important, that diagram. It's probably confusing to look at to a lot of people, but what I mean by what I say is that the borderline type of enlightenment cannot be shared by other people. That it is a solitary form of spiritual advancement. So they see themselves as being masters of the universe and reality and psychological reality, but they are accessing it in such a way that it cannot be shared by anyone else because it's not justified. It's not a real understanding. It's a procedure of, let's say, never-ending manipulation. So they have this non-stop manipulative um, procession of sort of soapbox exhibitionism that kind of hypnotizes some audience into playing into their melodrama or whatever. But anyway, so in some sense, they actually identify with the last two stages of Metagram, which they are taking responsibility for, but they actually have a double, it has a double face to it, because it's not just the two, it has two valent, it has two faces. The one is that it's the death and the lust of the ego function, and the other face of it is that it is the trial and the sin of the unconscious side of the mind. So they're like a double agent there, and in some sense they are privately in their ego. So in some sense they're probably very much related to Keegan stage 4.5. That's kind of what they are. The borderlines are Keegan stage 4.5 in some sense, as a kind of, as a dead mother archetype. And it's interesting because, as psychopathologies go, I imagine that they might be able to be. It'll be interesting to see if I can actually root this into Metagram, because the actual Metagram, I mean, this might be readable in the Metagram itself in some sense. And I mean, I always thought that perhaps I perhaps had a potential to be borderline personality disordered because of my Metagram having a double circuit that essentially, but I mean, I manifested, or at least the psychopathology that I was diagnosed with in some sense is borderline personality disorder. Sorry, not bipolar. Well, I mean, I don't know if I think it's generally considered to be a personality disorder, but I was diagnosed by bipolar type 1. So I misspoke. I've never been diagnosed with borderline, but I was diagnosed with bipolar because of having a major manic psychosis. Um, and I was heavily medicated, and I was under the care of psychiatry and drugged for about 5 years. Anyway, and I had major. I also had repeats of major manic episodes. Um, Probably about once every year and a half on average. I had 3 major manic psychotic episodes. I was hospitalized. Blah blah blah. Anyway, I think I've cured myself with my own psychological understanding of these things. But anyway, that's something for the medical books, perhaps, because I mean, technically, it should not be possible that someone should not be prone that someone should be able to be as stable as I am without medication. But I mean, I haven't been medicated for over 4 years, I believe. Well, that's the problem. Is that, who knows? Maybe I'm being slipped medication. Who knows? So one of the big problems of living in a system with experts that can essentially cast their wicked spells on you because they're called diagnoses, and these experts, the law itself is fundamentally crooked on this. That somehow you're allowed to poison people and make yourself prone to experimental psychiatric science, which doesn't know what it's doing, and the law doesn't know what it's doing, but somehow respects the expertise of these people who, I would say, in I can talk about historical examples of people um, that were allowed to actually recover, without the use of psychiatric intervention. But anyway, I mean, Newton had a major psychotic episode in his early 20s. Milton had a major psychotic episode in his early 20s. Wittgenstein had a major psychotic episode in his early 20s. And, they needed, and they were or some of them were at least institutionalized, and they were allowed to essentially capitulate their own schema, their own psychological um, structure in their mind. And Wittgenstein famously was called Wittgenstein II afterwards, because the character of his philosophy, the character of his work was so strikingly different. He was a different person, essentially. Anyway, that doesn't, I don't think that we allow for that to happen anymore. Also because we don't know what's going on in psychology, and so everything is permissible, sadly. Uh, you know, the history of psychiatry is certainly a horror story. I mean, how many lobotomies were carried out? Anyway, this is a bit of a tangent. Let me get back to the case in point. So, borderlines, I think, are quite clearly playing this two-faced game. And they are, in some sense, then I would say, existentially solipsists. Because, um, anyway, bipolar is much more complicated because I think that has to do with there being two circuits, um, and then having a kind of each circuit is having a developmental impingement, that essentially the one circuit I think is generally abused by the primary or the original circuit that ontologically developed. And because of the difference in development between the two circuits, um, there is a power imbalance, and the one uses the other one, and there isn't or maybe there's as much power sharing as is possible, but because of essentially there are differences, and sometimes you cannot just create an alchemical marriage between two circuits until each of them go their own separate way and develop their own separate way before they can be a good enough synthesis. That essentially the synthesis between the two circuits is not possible at certain levels of disparate perspective, in some sense, because there are differences in perspective, they share the same experience in some sense. So, to what level can each be fed equally, or something like that. And I think there is a clash of wills at some point, where one tries to take the steering wheel from the other one. Perhaps because the one knows that if the other one continues to power share, that essentially, I mean, I've described my own two circuits as a generalist circuit and a specialist circuit, or a particularist circuit. And so, there are two paths that are created generally by my prime death, or by the prime contract with the false prophet. Um, the basic engram of the case, essentially. And we all have this false prophet influence in our false ego complex. That is what sin generates out of. But it can only be tackled and actually overcome by going up through the top, to find the false prophet a second time through the whole complex, not tunneling back down to it. So there's no point in reaching it from the point at which that it operates, because it itself operates without justification. The false prophet is essentially a kind of a fictitious figment that has no real backstory, and you actually have to discover the backstory by going all the way the other side, by essentially going up through the sin of the ego and burdening the responsibility of the sin and the ego. Then you get a full backstory projected onto the false prophet, and therefore you can actually bring the knowledge of the tree of good and evil back into accord with the Holy Ghost, and back into being essentially the tree of life, so that the world's tree, as it were, has roots which are edified by the Christ consciousness of burdening the sin. Anyway, this is hard to describe this from this level, but essentially the crucifixion is important. The crucifixion of the mind. The crucifixion of the flesh, of the parent function in the ego. The enticed lust is essentially the source of the shadowy functioning of the false prophet. That when we can essentially cleanse the flesh of the enticed lust in the ego side of the mind, then, and we burden the trial, we burden the torture of crucifixion in the inferior function, which is in some sense being naturalized and homogenized with the dominant function in the ego. I might be wrong about that. I still don't. The vanity might actually need to be naturally cleansed in some sense. I don't. Perhaps the reconciliation between the inferior function and the vanity and the ego is something that perhaps cannot be actively alchemized in some sense. That might be, let's say, a natural growth in some sense, but all you can do is just actively take on the burden of the crucifixion. There's essentially, my understanding of Christ consciousness is there's no vicarious redemption. Jesus Christ, to speak of a person at all, is that he shows you the way, but you still have to follow the way. You have to die daily. You have to pick up your cross and follow him. There's no vicarious redemption. That we might be in his likeness, that we might reach the full stature of the Christ, as Ephesians chapter 4 speaks of. But anyway, that then the emergent property of the sin is being, the death of Christ is being contained within the body, and therefore you have essentially the unfolding of the backstory for the false prophet, which means that the false prophet is unmasked and perhaps also purified or cleansed or something like that. That is washed away. Because that unconscious, that backstory of the false prophet was essentially the blood that was trapped in Babylon the Great, was the blood of the saints, which was being fed to the whore of Babylon, essentially, which in some sense, this is the blood that essentially the false prophet was garnishing and directing towards. I guess in this example, I mean, it's hard to place this in metaphor or in archetype, it doesn't quite fit, but I mean, maybe it's a combination of those two dimensions beyond the sin of the ego, but also a kind of superimposition between the death and the lust. The death being the death and the lust of the subconscious, which the false prophet was gifting to the subconscious to begin the development of the false ego complex. But the problem is that the false prophet was never a real entity. It was a fictitious entity to begin with no real backstory, so it could not be untold. It was essentially also perhaps a necessary evil in some sense, because otherwise how would consciousness relate to the world? Without access to a kind of a world tree, you had to give up a part of your cognition, you had to give up a cognitive function in your stack in order to know the world through, in order to have, you need, the only way to engage yourself with the spirit of man was through the God of the world. So this is something like the morning star motif, is that the morning star is necessary. The world's tree is necessary. It was only that when we fell, when we ate of the fruit of the tree of life, and then we called it the knowledge of good and evil. But in some sense, that was a seduction, which the serpent, and something of the serpent has to do with the camouflage of Metagram, the camouflage of the turbulent sea of the unconscious, of this system of effort and counter effort and tumultuousness. Anyway, I still think I need certain processing myself, because I think that perhaps my tone arm in my ego might still be subject to certain layers of hypnosis and certain layers of suggestion. I mean, I remember even self-hypnotizing with certain commands and certain, let's say, transpersonal projective, because my whole project required me to emulate other people's psychologies, and I had to be able to empathize with people on such a deep level that I could almost empathize with their metagram. I needed to be able to telepathically, I needed to believe that I was telepathic and sensitive enough to read what was going on inside of them. And to a large extent, I did that by abusing my imagination to some degree, that essentially I would concoct context that would allow me to personalize myself with somebody else's thinking. And that's obviously quite invasive, but I mean, it's also a huge sort of projective sort of thing. And so I am probably laboring under a huge amount of false beliefs that were concocted imaginatively as part of hypnotic suggestion that I implanted in myself in order to undergo my project. So that is certainly interesting. And in some sense, I quite cleverly worked out ways to do that by keeping it private, as it were. And I mean, I kind of worked out how to do that from the Greek. I got some ideas from it, from essentially some of the Greek magic, or I wouldn't call it magic in some sense, but there are ways in which one can, it's not really magic, but in some sense that sexuality, eros, eros is actually, in the Greek genealogy of the gods, it is one of the highest forces, primordial sort of forces. And in terms of attraction, in terms of intrigue, in terms of seduction or whatever, in terms of you can relate to use Scientology language, you can relate everything into the second dynamic, and in some sense this is what makes most of society quite violent and perhaps dangerous as well. Is Freud went, there's a reason why Freud related everything to sexuality and sexual development, and because all issues can be contained within the field of sexuality. Death denial. You can very clearly work out um, the metaphor of every issue in some sense, in some kind of um, expression of sexuality in some sense. But well, that is somewhat necessary to explore, because in some sense it's the great unifying language. Um, in the same way that all language itself can be reducible to some either form of behavior, or I mean, and this is also why famously even the Hindu text, the greatest spiritual duty before all other spiritual duty is not to create unwanted population, and that covers every behavior and every even spiritual philosophy, because essentially by providing a bad example to how people might disregard their own heritage, or disregard any moral precept, or disregard any piece of philosophy, or you know, it's amazing how the prescription not to, perhaps just to make a finer point, not to promote the creation of unwanted population, covers literally anything and everything. You know, your failure to do the right thing and therefore create a bad example, you know, because people will naturally, I mean, well, this is understood in a very holistic way, that people, if people see that intentionality about you, that how you engage with people has that restriction built into it, that then people get a very rigid idea as to where lines must be drawn and not crossed, so as not to create a continuing cycle and spiral of doom in some sense. Um, because I mean, it's generally regarded that unwanted population is the greatest cause of let's say, unnecessary, but not only unnecessary, but particularly egregious forms of suffering on all levels, not just material suffering, but spiritual suffering and anguish. But in the final thing, I mean, these issues sadly are you know, you cannot define life by duty in some sense, but it's interesting how it does. This is something of one of the mysteries in the divided line, that the height of understanding is essentially something like duty, but the height of rationale inclines itself towards, let's say, resonance or recollection of the static oneness and the brilliant light of being, the I can't remember the Latin term, something luminosity, um, the one, the good, the everlasting, through which the mind is alive, the atmosphere, which is in some sense in the realm of the unseen, which is only in the realm of the intelligible, which is almost necessarily a private sort of thing, but in some sense how we can correspond with it externally in communication with other people is in some sense, I would say, everything, you know, sex is the function through which, or the process through which the generations are sustained, you know, and our relationship to sexuality has built within it, you know, a kind of a symbolic predilection and proclivity to dysfunction and institutionalized corruption and such. And this is why I guess sexual mores have often been the focus of at least exoteric religious systems and such. But it does, anyway. I'm talking a lot about these sorts of things. But there's a certain sense in which even sexual dysfunction is is a necessarily private matter, because one cannot just behaviorally stop something that actually has, let's say, an inherited narrative that needs some actual resolution, that needs some actual attention, because it's not about itself, it's about something else. And that's just merely how it's being manifested, and how it's being related in the understanding. But in some sense, it's because the understanding itself needs cultivation. Anyway, and in some sense, the understanding only ever provides the key. It it is not itself the door. Although after it opens the door, the understanding does become perhaps greater, because it becomes somewhat in alignment and unified with all the other, with essentially, let's say, the secret nexus of justified, or justification rather. That when the understanding becomes justified, which in some sense is a qualifier that it kind of inherits from the greater, the lesser of the greater, the third section of the divided line, which is in some sense, I mean, it's interesting that in some sense, it's only the first three sections of the divided line that I think are actually active at all. And the first section of the divided line is really the last one to come into conformity and, let's say, into joy and peace and contentment within the Holy Ghost, as it were. But when people try to get enlightenment from the first section of the divided line without doing the requisite work between the second segment and the third segment, the greater of the lesser and the lesser of the greater, then in some sense, because the first section must actually in some sense be a I don't know how to say this, at least metaphorically in some sense, be a representation, or let's say a fractal frame of the greater of the greater. Anyway, hopefully I will have worked out the diagram there to have this sort of displayed, but it's a bit, anyway, I've really gone off into lots of crazy places talking about this stuff. But so still, I'm going to have probably difficulties with, maybe I'm quite close to representing Metagram, but I also have to, it's interesting because I might be way off about some technical things, because I'm only using my own type to put these things into alignment. So if I clerically see how the other types line up, then it might be different. Or some of these technical things would have to change. But if I'm right that metagram is just the unconscious side of the mind, and then also how to kind of represent that in terms of the overspill into the subconscious and the overspill into the ego for the first two and the last two stages of metagram. But then also it will be interesting to see the context, and then maybe it's also worth it to put the vanity on the one side and the parent function of the subconscious on the other side, to know that it's happening in between these things. When all that context is sort of taken in, then you've got like a pretty good model of human development, and perhaps in terms of clinical therapy, you'll be able to place someone in their in their stage of arrested development or something like that. And where else? But even that does not really get into the actual, let's say, apex of self-actualization in terms of the tone arm, crucifixion type stuff. But anyway, but I mean, that's perhaps important because then essentially you can actually focus on getting over problems in development and then self-actualization afterwards as a sort of, as a crowning sort of thing, um, as a crowning sort of therapy. But this might be exactly what's needed in order to overcome the problems in the complications in certain psychopathology and things like that, or to sort of to displace psychiatry or psychology in some sense. Although, I mean, I do imagine that there are physical components to some of these things, where it could be understood. For example, like from the work from Dr. Amen, that certain amino acids are very good for fortifying the brain, perhaps, and such and such. Um, to help overcome and mend, but also the right psychological technology as well to overcome the certain of these obstacles or foibles or structural deficiencies or something, or at least, which I mean to some degree might also be culturally manifestations of cultural stagnation or the enculturation of certain psychological dysfunction or something like that. Uh, what's the other point? Is that yeah, and there might also be other technical complications which can be gleaned from this kind of modeling as well, because then you could understand how when Metagram itself contains components which itself interfere with the actual unconscious side of the mind itself, that you've kind of got a meta impediment on the metagram, and you also have perhaps different kinds of technical ambiguity as well. So yeah, again, the technical interpretation of metagram is still going to be a bit arduous, but I think I've at least explored all the puzzle pieces quite thoroughly now. Um, so at least I can try to model it. I mean, I've tried to at least, I think, lay out the simplest version of how it can be modeled, but it might be more convoluted than that, because it is the case that some emotional tones, it might be that the emotional tones are not connected to the metagram, to the unconscious natural sequence, but that the stages, that the metagram itself is just a sequence of emotional tones which themselves are subscribing to different elements between the two things that I spoke about, or rather contain the whole false ego complex from below the vanity of the ego, or maybe inclusive of the vanity of the ego, because I haven't looked at all the different types. But it would be interesting, because maybe the tone arm, in fact, only begins with the parent function in the ego, or the enticed lust of the ego. Maybe that's the true start of the tone arm. Maybe the vanity in the ego is included, but I mean, or maybe it's different for each metagram type. Maybe because I mean, this is the difference between metagram types, is that like they will have a natural grammatical weighting on some elements within the false ego complex. That is why you get such a different expression in people that, for example, very clearly, let's just say in MBTI language, have the same MBTI type, but they have this very clear stylistic weighting that's different, which I think actually comes out very clearly with people that have obviously the same subspecies of metagram, i.e. they are both sattva, or they are both rajasic, or they're both tamasic, and they have the same metatype, but they have a different metagram. And then it looks starkly interesting that, oh, well, how are these people so different, but they clearly have a stylistic? How are these people so similar, but they are also so clearly different? That never, that it's not just the content, there is a stylistic difference here, which is obviously greatly exacerbated in types that have more than one circuitry, because then there's a variance of development which is almost bespoke to some degree, and all the different types of technical ambiguity, which I've kind of already tried to roughly outline. Anyway, I'm just babbling now. Let me stop this recording. But this, in some sense, gives me some very clear scaffolding to start making tentative models of, let's say, technically integrating metatype and metagram. So there are two more points that I want to add, although this is kind of tacky to just add on these kinds of layers of things. But I think that between the sin in the ego and, let's say, the missing backstory of the false prophet, that archetypally those would be the roots of the world tree, which I'm actually making reference somewhat to the Nordic Viking religion of Nidhogg, that when Nidhogg eats the roots of the world tree, then everything ends, as it were. And I think that is actually, I think that mustn't happen. I think that must never happen in some sense, because I do think that the spirit of man, because in John, I really think that the Christian scriptures do have the final word on what's actually going on in spirituality. It is the most up-to-date sort of thing, that we needed all the other religious traditions and mystics and seers and prophets and judges to eventually culminate in understanding spiritual life, and we have actually gotten a better understanding growing into these issues or whatever. But that the root of the world tree is the spirit of man, is the Holy Ghost, and something. The Holy Ghost and the spirit of man are very much connected. That's why the Holy Ghost represents this forbidden knowledge, the forbidden knowledge of the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil are the same. The tree of the knowledge of the fruit, the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life are in fact the same tree. And this is just the Holy Ghost seen from two different angles, as it were. But the roots of this tree are between, let's say, when someone has a false ego complex, because we're living in the fall, as it were, the gap between the sin and the false prophet are the roots of the spirit of man, in some sense. And that has its own history, and that has had its own spiritual encoding of the issues, as it were, that need to be integrated and need to be sorted out by free theta, by the spirit of man, by the spirit of God. That essentially that this is the synthesis, is the Son of Man, is the Son of God. The Son. That's what the judges through Isaiah finally reckoned. What they finally came to realize was the solution will be the Son of Man, is the Son of God. Anyway, but what I'm just trying to say is that stillness between, let's say, the backstory of the false prophet is how the spirit of man has kept itself resonant with what has gone on in the world. what's my point here? Is that the roots are I think that the void between the sin and the ego and the false prophet, that nebulousness is what keeps the false prophet acting as the false prophet. And in some sense, that those roots, when they are finally discovered and looked through or something like that, that then, let's say, the falseness in the false prophet is somewhat purified in the lake of fire. Um, but anyway, or the actual crucifixion of the enticed lust, trial, and sin, and the burdening of that sin in the free theta is also perhaps the lake of fire, which is cleansing that void, which then is becoming a healthy root system for the spirit of man that is properly outlined, that is properly circumscribed. And in some sense, I'm trying to perhaps also speak of the spiritual circumcision of the heart as well. Um, but anyway, what was the insight here? The insight here was just that when in the fallen state, when it's not redeemed, that void is how essentially the spirit of man in an individual consciousness is tapping into perhaps something like the collective unconscious, which is essentially the vat of unfinished entanglement and, let's say, karmic, sort of karmic bondage to the flesh or whatever, because there's all this flesh that was fleshly thinking that was not crucified, that the sins of the parents were visited onto the children, that we inherited these tacit bonds, we inherited these this context layered on top of our own contribution to the fall from our own individual false ego complex, was also then filtered through, let's say, the multivariant and also the lostness, because there is not, in some sense, individuals have to deal with each other as individuals in the present. That is also, let's say, a valid frame, but then there is also, let's say, unknown unknowns about historical tacit implication, which you can call the collective unconscious. And somehow that boogeyman of the collective unconscious, I still feel that there is something fundamentally toxic about that conceptualization. Um, if I can, my voice recording got interrupted, but I don't know where I got to. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to describe though is that the root, the hidden root of the world tree, or the false prophets, the void between the backstory, the fake backstory. Because what's weird is that essentially the sin of the ego would be the death in the false egos, or sorry, in this, because the false prophet is essentially the parent function in the superego, but there is no the superego doesn't properly have a vanity, it doesn't properly have a lust, and it doesn't properly have a death, except that the death is represented or dual used, or is the sin in the ego. But you have to develop up to the point of actually taking responsibility for the sin in the ego. That if you take responsibility for the sin in the ego, then you actually have a key into the death of the superego. So that's the kind of connection there. And in some sense, so the sin of the ego is the death of the superego, and therefore the two subsequent things are the lust and the vanity. So those two things I'm calling basically the root of the world tree, or let's say the nebulous backstory of the false prophet. And in some sense, I think that those are kind of like raw antennae, sensitive sort of things that just will naturally conform to a kind of environmental flux or whatever. It will just sort of attenuate itself to what's going on, into mapping the kind of, it's kind of like the unconscious contextualization of the environment of the world, something like that. So in some sense it's kind of like the two pillars in the God of the world or something like that. But damn, I had a better construction of this, or a better reduction of it, is that those two things are, another way of describing it is no, I've lost it now. Um, Something more about it being the backstory, the nebulous backstory of the false prophet. That, oh, that essentially, because essentially, in some sense, that's what makes the false prophet allow it to be a false prophet, because it privately. Oh, this is so annoying. I keep on getting interrupted by phone calls, but so the false prophet is privately purveying, let's say, this void between the sin of the ego, which is also the death of the false prophet, which is otherwise claimed by the false prophet to be its private purveyorship over, that essentially it can create and concoct between, in some sense, this is how the superego is casting a shadow that eventually manifests as the sin of the ego. So the death of the superego is the sin of the ego side of the mind. And that is what makes the sin from the false ego complex in the ego side of the mind this emergent thing. It's not contained within the false ego complex. It's somewhat projected and shared by everything, because and this is the great power that the superego has over everything in some sense. And so as the tone arm of the free theta in the ego side of the mind eventually gets a handle on the sin, which is also the death in the superego, that essentially, as that is contained within the body, there is this conformity, there is this growth of the tone arm into what was the voided space, the nebulousness that the false prophet was utilizing. And so all this kind of ambiguity, all this nebulousness that was the devil's playground, as it were, that was allowing the false prophet to be able to essentially make its unilateral purveyorship of these cognitive functions, that the tone arm was, let's say, under the, was kind of quashed in relation to, or something like that, was impinged upon, or was having to sort of contend with contextually, or make room for. Um, so essentially, as the sin in the ego side of the mind is being kept in the body, as it were, boundaries, clear boundaries between internal locus of control and, let's say, external locus of control, in the voided space of this void between, or let's say within the body of the superego, which was never properly grounded and rooted and anchored, now is being anchored from the ego side of the mind. So, and this is the thing, is that, this is what I think is meant when it talks about, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that we may have life through him, or something like that. But essentially, what's in the doctrinal sense, which you get very clearly in the King James, is that, it says there are lots of scriptural references that have this weird kind of asymmetry. Give and it will be given. And it says, that you must essentially give the gift that is Jesus Christ to the world. But that doesn't mean that the world can receive it. But you must still give it. So give and it will be given. But it still doesn't mean that it will be received. So, and this is where essentially the burdening the sin of the world is taken on by the individual, but it is not received by the world. So this is, so these voided, this kind of voided space, in some sense, that is being ordered by the proper, let's say, burdening of the sin, and then, metaphorically, archetypally, it's, well, 3 days in the grave before Christ is resurrected. On the third day, the false prophet is takes on a new character, is wearing a new a garb, in some sense. It's no longer drenched in the blood of the saints, as it were. It's no longer in this dirty business of funneling um, anyway, the point of all of this, is, the point of all of this is that look, fundamentally, you can also archetypally reduce all the problems of the false ego complex into the superego. And if the superego is finally, let's say, completed through the work of the crucifixion, then I guess what I haven't come to terms with yet is how to properly structure the superego, and to be conscious of the superego, so that all the sides of the mind are now then perfectly square. That it's the four even sides, and the water, the clarity, the transparency of the four sides of the mind sort of comes through. But so yeah, I haven't probably come to grips with this, because in some sense the problem is that the superego never had vanity before. It never had a lust. It never had a death. In some sense, the death was being experienced in terms of the sin of the ego. But a sin and a death being the same thing is quite novel, because that only happens from the ego. So that makes the whole system quite weird and interesting and strange. But essentially, yeah, the kind of how the superego actually gets knitted together cohesively will also then eventually stabilize the crucifixion as well, that's happening in the ego. So the passing off of the crucifixion into the superego. But I'm just still trying to think how to structure the superego, because I mean, look, generally in all the side, and it might be somewhat unique. So let me just put a caveat on everything that I'm about to say, because it might be incorrect, because this is novel territory to some degree. But to use the rest of the sides of the mind as somewhat of an analogy, usually the fractious part is that the vanity which is the hero function, and the enticed lust, which is the parent function, and the inferior, which is the trial, I mean, the thing is that the superego itself has never had a trial and a sin before, because it's always just automatically donated that its trial and the sin was always just used as the death and the lust, but it was also bestowed on the subconscious from the superego because it was easy for it to do so, because it was just a floating parent function that had no dominant function to serve. It had no child function to serve. It didn't have um, a lust, essentially, which is now, yeah. So this is all a bit strange to some degree, because in some sense, the lust is often the vanity is often archetypally represented as a city, and the lust is archetypally represented as the whore of Babylon. And in some sense, I think that this could, in Revelations, be transposed into the what is described by the dragon and the woman and the baby that fly off. But essentially, obviously, the point is that the great Babylon the Great needs to be supplanted by the New Jerusalem. So essentially, that vanity in the superego, I think, would be something like the New Jerusalem, where the streets are made of glass, and the fruit trees that have, I can't remember, 1,000 fruit trees blossoming 1,000 fruits or whatever. And the lust is like the bride of Christ, perhaps, or something like that. But in terms of the superego, in terms of what when the tone arm is growing and extending from the embodied conscious sin that is uh, struck against the flesh and the ego, out of which certain boundaries and certain borders and certain cognizances in terms of the superego is brought under heel, and then essentially, I mean, what does need to be deprogrammed perhaps is that the false prophet, you will have habitual issues. You will have the false prophet will be so used to donating the trial and the sin to be used as the death and the lust of the subconscious, but now those will take on a trial and a sin aspect in some sense, or perhaps they will be negated entirely. Perhaps the subconscious will kind of dissipate, will be, let's say, because essentially the death and the lust in the subconscious will be supplanted by the superego's perfection. So, in the perfection of the superego, perhaps the subconscious will eventually wither and die, and essentially the garden and the tree of life, as it were, will be re-established around the superego. So perhaps the subconscious will naturally dissipate, will be sort of novated by a new personality that centers essentially around the ego and the superego, and in some sense maybe. Anyway, that might be incorrect. I mean, they might, in some sense, maybe the unconscious side of the mind, maybe the metagram, in some sense, is revived as a kind of transcendental antenna, in terms of that it keeps the false ego complex is not is transcended, but it is, let's say, frozen within some configuration of itself. It is actually that the metagram, so sections of the metatype are reordered, and then it's somewhat in its rubric it is kept, because essentially that is how we can all engage in karma, but we can learn about karma from each side, because now that we have access to the superego, we have, let's say, a transcendental way of seeing all the fruit, or something like that. But and not just from the particular vine that allowed us to trace ourselves back to the garden or something like that. Bit of mixed poetry and metaphor, but yeah. So anyway, I'm not exactly sure then in therapy, in describing therapy, what the true relationship is between the subconscious. How is the superego in its new state from the crucifixion orientated towards the subconscious? Does it maintain some element of it? Does it allow, in some sense, is the death and the lust of the subconscious tempered by the function of the trial and the sin, because now the false prophet is no longer just providing a death and a lust to the subconscious. It's actually also having its own role within its own garden in some sense. And so the sense that the false ego, or the ego, the conscious ego, that is no longer false, because what made the false ego false was the fact that the false prophet, the parent function in the superego, was itself a half-finished, half-baked, occluded entity that was essentially more fiction than it was. It was more nebulous than it was. So because it was unset, it was allowed. It could always continue to proffer and fill in yet more mysterious confection. So it was this kind of never-ending cacophony of a sort of, of a snake shedding its skin and creating ever more camouflage, of ever more anyway, like this continual shedding of the skin. But anyway, I'll have to think about this some more. Okay, this doesn't help that I'm adding layer upon layer of conjecture and theoretical speculation and expansion, but let me just move on, because I think that this actually does put things into at least some semblance of a technical interpretation of metagram within the context of metatype. So, because I was just going through the numbers then, that essentially if the unconscious side of the mind is the middle of the metagram, and then the first two stages have a duplicate in the subconscious trial and sin, and the last two stages have a duplicate in the ego's death and lust. When you add those duplications, you get you go from 6 to 10. And I believe in Revelations there is well, at least, when it talks about the beast, it talks about many different types of beasts. One with 3 heads, one with 7 heads and 10 horns, and also I think I can't remember. I have to go through it again, but it also talks about 10 crowns as well in one of the ways in which the beast is depicted. So there we have the 10, perhaps. The 7, I think, might be correlated. And it's interesting because, obviously, this might be somewhat hinting the dream of St. John at Patmos. There's a particular sequence in the unfolding of talking about the beast. And so it might be that somewhat he's alluding to, or prophetically dreaming and having a metaphorical, allegorical representation of, let's say, the sequence of development, or how essentially the nature of the false ego complex is revealed in terms of how the God of the world is being reformed by the revelation of the God of the earth and the heavens. But anyway, and the Alpha and the Omega, and the Christ consciousness, and the double, anyway, that the I'll say as well that the throne of the Alpha and the Omega that has the four creatures. Anyway, I would link that to my Platonic metaphysic of the divided line, but anyway, um, the four alchemical elements in some sense, lots of symbolism there, and also the 24 elders that are around the throne very much, I would say, corresponds to my 24 emotional tones that make up that make up the field circuits. But anyway, so I think it corresponds quite nicely to the Christian scriptures, all of my research. But the the seven heads, I think, will obviously then, I think, will be the six unconscious, will be the representation of the six component parts that are in the unconscious mind, and in some sense, the seven is made up of the fact that the six prime ones inside the unconscious side of the mind have the first two stages are duplicated in the subconscious, and the last two stages are duplicated in the ego in terms of the unconscious. But their base is six, so it can be accurately reduced to six, and then the seventh would be either the vanity in the ego or the parent function or the enticed lust in the subconscious, or both conflated. And in some sense, the seven, the visage, the motif of the seven-headed beast, in some sense, that might be how people are trapped within Metagram, is when the vanity and the ego is seen to correspond with the subconscious enticed lust. And then in some sense you're trapped between that, essentially that boundary, or that it becomes essentially the prime container. And then in some sense that when it talks about also, you say I have to get the sequence of this properly from Revelations, but when it talks about the beast with three heads and one of them is badly bruised, that the head of the beast that gets badly bruised, I mean, I'd have to, so I can recontextualize this on the fly. So I mean, I kind of don't know what I'm talking about because I haven't familiarized myself with the context of it immediately. But it could be either that one of those has to give in order to make conquest, in order to make progress in working out the mystery, in working out the revelation of God, and unraveling the entanglement of the false ego complex. And I think that in some sense the head, when you have the three heads of the beast and one of them is badly bruised, perhaps the head that is badly bruised is essentially is the representation of the three sides of the mind, the three inverted commas positive sides of the mind: the subconscious, the unconscious, and the ego. And I would say that the unconscious gets badly bruised, so that the vanity of the ego can be properly confronted, because that is the door to free theta. That is the door to being able to start the process of the crucifixion, in order to start to burden the Christ consciousness. Obviously, probably at the same time, this would have to be allegorically corresponded to the two witnesses in the two cities, the two witnesses in sackcloth and things like that. I'm not sure if that's a concurrent sort of motif. But obviously the two cities would correspond to two sides of the mind, the two remaining sides of the mind. And the two witnesses in some sense would either be the kind of the radicalized parent functions, the radicalized enticed lust that is willing actually to proselytize to the city, to the vanity. And so essentially the parent function is turning itself against the dominant function, almost in support of the inferior function, to help the inferior function cut away the dead things of the vanity, to cut away the decadence of the vanity, as it were, to free and dislodge the blood of the saints that has been locked into the city of Babylon, Babylon the Great, to sort of to tarnish its greatness, and eventually the vanity will rise up and will kill that parent function. The witnesses will die, but those parent functions were really mighty for a time. It says in Revelations that they command the weather, that they command that they can speak, and the weather will obey. And the witnesses in sackcloth. But so I do think that those are the parent functions of the unconscious side of the mind in the midst of the metagram, and in the ego perhaps as well. And then obviously one of them especially gets essentially, because the parent function, and what if it is the parent function of one of those witnesses becomes the proto-Christ, essentially, or develops into the Christ consciousness that actually takes on the sin of the world. That one of those witnesses, anyway, I don't know how far that particular strain in the dream is carried, but and then somewhat perhaps it merges into the motif of the lady and the dragon and the child to be born. And then it obviously gets into the Jerusalem and such. Anyway, and obviously it speaks a lot about Babylon the Great and those things, but yeah, it probably would behoove me to go through Revelations again. But yeah, I think it's somewhat coming together nicely. It's just it is problematic about how I'm going to model metagram integrated in metatype, because it seems to me more and more now that metagram becomes a more holistic typology or something like that. I've always seen metatype and metagram as distinct, and now I'm perhaps really concocting quite a solid fusion of the two, quite a solid synthesis. Still don't know. The problem is that the modeling of this is different depending on perhaps also, you could say, spiritual advancement in terms of is there anything else for me to say about this? Yeah, I mean, it still remains to be seen if it will be a stable way to kind of use the 6 metagram cognitive functions as sort of anchor points for holding the emotional tones, and then the emotional tones themselves are themselves quite strange. And there are some also ancillary issues that I had worked out that, it is interesting as well, because on some level, and this might be an angle on metatype. Sorry, this I should mention in a completely separate breath, because this is really quite raw speculation. But the weird thing about metatype is that so many sides of the mind, or so many metatypes are themselves very much related to other metatypes. So much so that in some way there are only 4 grand metatypes or something like that, but in different sequences, that like one person's subconscious is another person's unconscious, is another person's superego or something like that. So in some sense we can represent one to another different aspects. But what I wanted to say about that, which is quite strange, is I don't know if it's perhaps possible guess, yeah, I was playing with an idea which is still probably much too theoretical. If it's possible for people to change their metatype within a multiple of 4, that like a metatype 13 could become a metatype 9, could become a metatype 5, could become a metatype 1. It is a very strange kind of thing. And I don't know if I can't say this with any confidence at this point, but in some sense I have always thought that my metatype is a very special metatype. That metatype 13 might be something of the apex of the whole system, which is perhaps is a premature claim for me to make. But it's interesting that essentially how, if you can migrate your metatype, if you migrate it if you can migrate it in a multiple of 4, which I think might be possible, because I think that in some sense 4 is kind of like a magic number. It's almost like the number of metaphor itself as well. This is a bit of wordplay maybe, but in some sense, if you can metaphorically extend your own prime death that is created by your false prophets, you might be able to create, let's say, a replanted false prophet. You might be able to kind of create a sub-command post of a new false prophet that eventually kind of magnetically absorbs the role of the false prophet, or something like that. And in some sense, this might also be happening to some infants, to some children that, I mean, I don't know at what point the false prophet is elected, or the false prophet is but I do think that essentially the false prophet is a necessary evil in development, because I don't think that you can actually have an experience of the outside world without giving up a part of your cognition to essentially be able to experience the world. That you have to create a god of the world, that in some sense it's a necessary, that we have to live with the spirit of man. The spirit of God and the spirit of man must eventually comport. You know, it talks about by blood and by water, um, even as flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom. Um, but to say that essentially the channel of manifestation, that the blood is the witness of. Not get too mystical and esoteric, but talking a bit of nonsense, that the spirit of man needed time to manifest its uh, needed time to manifest sin well enough that when the Son of Man could take the world tree and the spirit of man uh, as its bride, that the understanding, the Christly understanding, could take the spirit of man as a consort. That is not possible until the sin was well enough manifested, because otherwise taking the burden of the sin of the world would essentially be a nebulous um, So essentially, the blood was not ready. The blood was not ripe, something like that. It was not ripe in the blood to have so I just want to say that basically, the Messiah, the spirit of the Messiah, I think has been active the whole time, or the spiritual lineage, or whatever you want to call it, or the the apostolic disciplic uh, line from that. I don't know where to talk about it, but essentially from Adam to Cain to Lacrima to sorry, is it Lamech, to Lamech, uh, that David sung about in Psalms, that 77 times Lamech would be avenged if Cain 7 times would be avenged. Uh, yeah, Lacrima is actually, I think, a demonic sort of Gosha entity or something. But anyway, the Key of Solomon or something. But Lamech, anyway. What to say about the spirit of man? Could also say something about the mark of Cain or something like that. But the point is that although Cain was wrong, he also wasn't not right, essentially. And this is what I'm talking about, is that the blood has to become ripe in the manifestation, so that there can be a redemption, because there cannot be a redemption when the sin is not even fully knowable. You cannot forgive in the hypothetical, as it were. Or at least you can't do so in the true spiritual sense. You might be able to do so on some kind of other sense, but the spirit of man has there been waiting this whole time to be gardened by the Spirit of God, but after the garden being uh, this is going to be a horrible metaphor. Let me just stop. I guess I was going to say, once the garden has already kind of grown out of control, and there already are these sort of hybrid strains and these new fruits, they have to become edible before we can even know what to do with them yet. So we have to kind of allow them to fester or allow them to continue to grow until we can know them by their fruit, essentially. So that's what I'm saying about the spirit of man, is that uh, the blood has to be ripe for the harvest, as it were. Um, Otherwise, essentially, the judgment is not seen as justice. The justice cannot seen to be justified. Anyway, it's something like the distinction between nescience and ignorance. But yeah, I just want to say that I think this was always available, though. This is not like, you know, the kingdom of God was always at hand. It was always within arm's reach. It just required someone to actually do the work. Uh, you could say a work of faith, or the great work, even as is spoken about in spiritual alchemy, the philosopher's stone, the magnum opus. Is this not what Jung spoke about? Probably in the Aeon or something. Uh, anyway, yeah, I mean, to a large extent, I'm standing on the shoulders of these people quite clearly. Carl Jung, who stood on the shoulders of those alchemists that he studied, and St. John of Patmos and such.